About the geopolitical approach of the EU foreign policy in the framework of the third panel today, we'll discuss Mr. Milan Brglez, professor at the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Ljubljana. Mr. Ulrich Kronz, professor at the European University Institute. And Mr. Alistair Shepherd, professor at the Aberystwyth University. But before we start with this panel, two remarks. One of the panelists should be also Mr. Carlo Jean, president of the Center for Economic Geopolitical Studies in Rome, but because of the health issues, he had to cancel his participation. However, he has sent an outline of his thoughts, and Mr. Laris Geiser will present it briefly. The second remark, Mr. Adrian Haidt-Price, professor at the University of Bath, was also meant to be part of this panel. Unfortunately, again, the health issues are the reason that he cannot be with us in Ljubljana. However, the moderator of the panel, Mr. Igor Kovac, head of the Ljubljana office of the Regional Forum for International and Strategic Studies Reformis, will incorporate his thoughts into the discussion. Dear panelists, the floor is yours until 4 p.m.
Ladies and gentlemen, once again, welcome. Welcome back from the dinner. I'm very much happy to see that you are healthy and safe here, given that half of our panelists are in the hospital. And among them, of course, also the Lieutenant General of the Italian Army, Carlo Jean, that is sending you the best regards from the hospital in Rome. The second remark, if you allow me, Professor Krotz, welcome. We rescue you from Frankfurt strike.
You did.
We managed to did it finally during the night to bring you here among us. So thank you very much for everything that you supported in these last hours in Frankfurt.
Thank you. It's much nicer than to stay on the airport.
You know, we used all our connections.
It's scary. Yes, I am certain about that.
Well, look, I have here only 15 pages prepared by General Carlo Jean, so take it easy, relax. I will summarize, or better said, I will read only a few pieces in order to give possibility of discussion to the panelists moreover. The document will be, however, put it later on as a proceeding in our volume that we are going to publish during the year about this conference. The title of the paper is Challenges to European Security by Lieutenant General of the Italian Army, Carlo Jean. From the introductory remarks. In October 2012, the European Union was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. That decision provoked many puzzlements and ironic remarks similar to those addressed to the President Barack Obama 3 years ago. In reality, the European Union is the biggest peacemaking institution in the world, promoting peace, democracy, and human rights. The growing importance of security and defense matters was stressed last December during the European Council summit, when those issues were put on the agenda to be discussed by the heads of states and government. The European Union has decided a growing number of civilian, military, and both civilian and military interventions, especially in Africa. In Mali, it means in Mali, Libya, now organizing a mission in South Sudan, in Central African Republic. The forces of its member states have reached a good degree of interoperability, and it is of Afghanistan also a combat interoperability. It is an asset not to be lost in the post-Afghanistan period. The European Union armaments industry is technologically updated, although the decrease of the R&D and procurement funds in the European defense budgets has obliged the major groups to expand their activities on the US and especially on the Asian markets. But in major interventions, the European Union needs the logistic and operational support of the United States of America. Moreover, the level of the European integration is unsatisfactory, often requesting the American NATO leadership. The reduction of military budget is decreasing the European Union international influence, as is increasing its dependence on the United States of America. Presently, the European nations retain extensive military capabilities, but are resisting to emerge them, fearing to lose of sovereignty and freedom of action more than a worldwide marginalization. Their national interest and security perception are different, especially after the European Union and NATO enlargement and the turmoil in the Mediterranean basin. The European ambitions to be a global player, a pillar of the new multipolar world order, are not supported either by political will or by the availability of government to devote sufficient resources to maintain an adequate power projection capability. There is a crucial limit to the public attitude towards the defense spending that underestimates its utility, especially for the European Union, because the existential security needs are guaranteed by NATO and the United States' presence in the continent. Many European states prefer the American rather than European leadership. This lack of trust between the Europeans was evident in Bosnia-Herzegovina and Kosovo, but especially in Libya intervention in 2011. The identification of challenges to European security is further complicated by the extension of the concept of security from the military field to an array of other sectors. It is what is called comprehensive security concept. The Atlantic Alliance more and more involves itself also in the civilian aspects of the security policy. With its ambition to take the lead, NATO is often seen as a competitor of the European Union that also wants to be the player. That is impossible without the consent of Washington. A division of labor between NATO and the European Union civilian has become impossible. The tensions between the two institutions are growing. In any case, the EU lacks the unifying leadership and the powerful escalation capability possessed by the United States and NATO. The German flag axis is weaker and weaker. The decline of Europe's global influence also in its near neighborhood does not depend on money. Generally, we are accustomed to attribute the European decline on the global arena to the cuts of the European security budgets of both the armed forces and the other components of the external policy and security instruments. That is incorrect. The European weakness results from the division and the growing fragmentation of the geostrategic and geopolitical Europe. The policies, interests, and perspectives of the European states member are not only different, but often divergent and sometimes opposed. It is sufficient to consider the differences between Poland and Italy as far as priorities of the security challenges from the south and from the east are concerned, or the different strategic cultures and power projection capabilities of the UK and France vis-à-vis those of the other European Union member states. The European Union is, at the same time, too weak and too large. It is too weak mainly because the European Union institutions put the definitions of the external policies at the intergovernmental level, with very little power given to the communitarian one, that is, to the Commission and to the European Parliament. This forbids to the European Union not only to have common security and defense strategies, but also common, coherent policies for crisis management. This weakness have been increased by the enlargement towards the East. They increase the differences and the geopolitical fragmentation of the European Union. As far as the security is concerned, the glue of the Union is provided essentially by the United States of America. Many people remember the tragic gap existing between Europe's ambitions and its real capabilities, first of all in terms of political common will, expressed in the summer 1991 by the foreign minister of the rotating presidency of the European Union for the crisis in the Balkans, with the phrase, "The hour of Europe has arrived." Europe has never been so prosperous and so secure and so free, Solana, a few years later. But it has not specified that all of this depended on the American engagement and the leadership of NATO. This is the word of the Lieutenant General Carlo Jean, a really European friend. Good discussion, please.
Yeah.
Good luck.
Thank you very much, Laris. Thank you, Carlo Jean. Those of you who know me know that I've moderated quite many panels, but I think this is the first time that I'm really nervous. And why? Just look around. I mean, I'm surrounded by a professor formerly from Ivy League University, from Brown University. On the other side is a professor from Aberystwyth University, which was the first university in history that introduced international relations as an academic discipline back in 1919. And of course, right next to me is my dear Professor Burgles, a great IR scholar whom I admire very much, and who was also an editor of an IR journal with the famous Professor Guzzini. And if Professor Jean and Professor Hyde Price, whom both we all wish all the best in hospital, would be here, I would probably fall down. But you know, how to tackle this nervousness is of course with a joke. And doing this, I will hopefully send also the blood from your stomachs to your heads, to your brains, and to your ears. So here's the joke. With the Lisbon Treaty, European Union finally got the famous telephone number that Henry Kissinger requested. And of course, there was a person, a young lady, who went up to Henry Kissinger in the US and said, Mr. Kissinger, the EU has its phone number now. You can call them. And he said, okay, I will. And then he calls this number, right? And the machine answers. And the machine goes, thank you for calling the European Foreign Action Service hotline. If you would like to hear the opinion of Germany, please press 1. And so on. So what does this joke describe? It describes the biggest problem that the European foreign policy, and that's also European geopolitics, faces. And in the past 3-4 panels that we had, we were tackling this issue. So how European foreign policy is being framed, this internal struggle, how to overcome this national diversity, different interests that we all have. So this is on the one side, Scila. And on the other side, the European geopolitics has also Charybda, which is, let's say, in my opinion, really tiny problem, so it's much smaller monster. And this is, of course, the international structure. So what are the international pressures, let's say the rise of the BRICS countries, the challenges of NATO, and so on. So challenges coming from the outside of the EU. So EU has to sort of maneuver itself between these two monsters, Scila and Charybda. But as I said, the first one, Scila, is much bigger. And that's why we will devote the first round, or the first topic of this panel, to this question, again, to the internal struggles that we face. And then the second part of the panel will be dedicated to the Charybda. So what are the relations between the EU and US, EU and Russia, and EU and China? And then in the end, of course, you will have the chance to pose the questions. Right, so let's begin. I would start with Professor Krotz. Let's start with the thing that Mr. Geisser just said, your trouble at the Frankfurt airport. As you know, the airport was on strike. And to depict how the EU does not function, I mean, the EU institutions, it's also Star Alliance. Adria Airways is a member, Lufthansa is a member. He should be flying with Adria Airways, yet Lufthansa did not want to rebook his flight from yesterday to today. We had to do it from Ljubljana at 10 o'clock in the evening yesterday. So, what does this tell you? A big chaos. You know, it's a nice story that depicts a big chaos. So, Professor Krotz, can you tackle this chaos? Can you map out the nature and structure of the European geopolitics, of the European foreign policy?
Well, is this on?
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Or if you take it in your hand, might be.
No, I'll leave it like that. Well, thank you very much for having me. I was delighted when I received the invitation, and I was very happy to accept it. Thanks also for getting me here. So these are two different thank yous. And I must say, on the one hand, that actually it's a good way to tell the story. What Lufthansa essentially told me when I tried to get rebooked was, yes, we are friends with Adria Airways, but not that close friends, right? If you want them to do something, you have to talk to them directly, and then maybe it's really unfortunate that this fits so nicely. Adria Airways apparently does not have a representative office in Germany nor a telephone number, and when I called here, it didn't work well. On the other hand, so it's a serious thank you. I do not know what Igor and the organizational committee did here, but they did something, and they did it in worrisome effectiveness and efficiency. So actually, it is a bit scary. I do not know who your connections here are, but seem to be very well connected. In a way, I have an apology that I essentially present to you in my traveling clothes, because my bag has not arrived. My bag is still lost in that chaos in Frankfurt, and it's very bothersome because I wanted to dress more properly. On the other hand, I was a little bit relieved too, because it seems that you and your organizers' influence and power seems to reach its limits somewhere. Yeah. So much for that. Thank you much for having me. It's been a pleasure to come here. On the question, on the substance, finally. How can we think of this overall thing, European foreign policy? Is it messy? Is it a mess? Without question, it's quite messy. Is it a hopeless mess? That I think it is not. In fact, I mean, I'm not talking about secrets here. This comes out of my recent work. It's not yet published, but will be published fairly soon. In my view, what we can tell is that this thing we call, this mess we call European foreign security, perhaps defense policy, is taking contours, is taking a certain shape, which we can describe as what it is. And as I will try to suggest to you in my answer to the first question here, it is something that is not transient, it's unexpected, it's unfamiliar, it's historically not intended, it's politically novel in many ways, certainly unfamiliar, but it is also not something that is just quickly on the way to something else, either return to complete nation-stateness, nor is Europe on the rush to something like a nation-state just bigger. In my view, it's become clear where this in-between lies, and I will try to outline that for you with some very broad strokes, broad sketch. I have come to call this way Europe acts in the world and Europe relates to the world a tripartite mode of relating to the world and dealing with the world. What do I mean with tripartite? Let me just name the three elements, the three parts, and I will flesh this out a little bit. The one part of this tripartite way, Europe has foreign relations and a kind of foreign policy that takes place on the union level and is supranational. A word on this in a moment. It also has an aspect, an element of foreign policy that also does take place on the union level, but it is intergovernmental. And the third part of this tripartite way is the continued relevance of national foreign security and defense policy. And I don't know, I do not exactly know the kind of audience, but those of you, just very briefly, in terms of what the founding fathers, let's take Jean Monnet, Robert Schuman, etc., as well as the first theorist of European integration, neo-functional theory, they did not expect it. They either politically wanted somehow move within a few decades to a united Europe, one way or another united perhaps, but a Europe that gets a new center and sometime I think Haas was very clear, and in my view was clear when you read carefully Monet and Schumann. I think they were thinking about a couple of decades, 4, 5, 6, 7 decades, and then you would get a Europe that somehow speaks with one voice, right? That's not what we get, that's clear. I'm suggesting Europe now has 3 voices. But what we also did not get is the intergovernmental opponents, politically, Charles de Gaulle perhaps, brilliantly academically, Stanley Hoffmann with his outstanding 1966 piece on the continued relevance of the nation state in Europe, while neither Monet nor Schumann got it right, in a sense, right? Nor Haas and his followers and his students. At the same time, de Gaulle and Stanley Hoffmann also didn't get it quite right. Europe is not, or it turned out that Europe has not become eternally stuck in nation-stateness, where the nation-state would be the sole voice or the sole actors when it comes to what classically is called high politics, foreign security and defense. What turned out as a unintended piecemeal product of European integration over 50 years plus by now, 50, 60 years, is a particular way of how Europe deals in the world, relates to the world, acts in the world, in a way the outward merge of its internal constitution, of its polity. What the founding fathers and the early theorists and their critics, whether de Gaulle, Hoffmann, or others, shared is that they were thinking about a tension or a struggle between one or the other element, right? When de Gaulle thought about more nation state or the continued relevance of the nation state in Hoffmann's thinking, that for them meant less supranationalism and probably also less intergovernmentalism, right? That's also not what we seem to have received after 60 years. What we seem to have gotten is that it's possible that we have more of both, plus the survival and the continuous high relevance of national foreign policy at the same time. So unlike early politicians, no matter whether at a supranational or the national level, or early theorists, no matter of what camp, it's not in a way a fight, it seems to me, it turned out, but what we in fact have is more of all of the 2 union level elements at the same time, and not necessarily less of national foreign and security policy, right? So instead, what we get is particular configurations, particular combination of all 3 of these. They coexist. They do not necessarily peacefully coexist, right? We get the full range, and the full range may be that Europe, with its 3 voices, may speak fairly understandably. Maybe not quite with one voice, but with a few voices that are close to each other. Or you can get a Europe that has quite different voices that do not fit together, right? The range, of course, goes all the way to the other end, where you find a Europe hopelessly divided, where different voices from these 3 types fight and disagree. If I have another 2 or 3 minutes,
Go ahead, yes,
let me just
absolutely.
briefly flesh out, and then I want to give one example. I think I might give more example once we turn to the second round, or second part, as Igor introduced them. The union supranational level is not insignificant. Right? Just think for trade at the moment. This is not foreign, it's not security and defense, no? But when it comes to trade, Europe is a superpower. And it is entirely or almost entirely supranationalized. When the trade commissioner speaks internationally in negotiations, it's one single voice that represents the EU as a whole, including its 500 million citizens. So I'm just saying this, it's not the case, and this is foreign policy, and it matters a lot, right? It's not security and defense, but it's there. Similar things you might get from the ECB, which surely is not a classic foreign policy actor, but it's fully supranationalized, and many of its decisions quite obviously have significant foreign policy implications. So you have this, and it exists, and it's not negligible, but at the same time you have coexisting a union-level intergovernmental element. And 2 examples of this that show us how much that matters by now too. by the way, no misunderstanding, still fragile. Maybe I should cut the still, we don't know. Fragile, surely fragile for quite some time to come, often highly contingent. But do not forget the European Union has put together so far about 20 civilian missions abroad, from very small to not so small. And we, the European Union, we have now, depending exactly how you count, 8 to 10 military operations. And this is pretty much, by everything but the name, leading contingent wars abroad. This does not take place supranationally, and it is also no longer rooted in national foreign policy. It is union level, but it is intergovernmental. And it is not necessarily fighting at all with the EU union supranational level that I just mentioned. I think best example, a trade. Other examples you easily can add to your own list in your minds, right? So in that case, it turned out differently than theoretically expected. It turned out differently than politically expected and politically decided by many, no matter whether there was more the supranational or intergovernmental level. And now comes the third, is neither of these two types of European voices did away with national foreign security policy at all, period. So this is a very particular way of something having grown historically over long decades that was neither theoretically expected, nor politically planned, nor politically desired, nor is it the result of a successful political inhibition campaign in the way making sure that supranational Europe does not take over, right? It's a historical outcome that is unfamiliar to us, and not only to us, it's less unfamiliar to us than to almost everybody from the outside. And this is the last example I want to give, and then it's enough for this first round. You can see this tripartite voice in many different arenas, how Europe relates to the United States now, and how about that later, and to other rising powers or emerging powers, China, the other BRICS as well, in international organizations. And here perhaps the G20 is the prime example. It is very strange, perhaps more for the others than for the Europeans themselves, that we are there with all three voices. So we have, of course, the supranational institutions are represented. The president of the European Commission represents Europe. The European Commission, the supranational aspect of the European Union, or one of those, at the G20. At the same time, national officials speak for the European Council. So the Council is also there, and it is not at all the same, and it's not necessarily even the same voice, the same position, the same view from the president of the Commission, but it is not a European representative of the highest order, just representing a nation state, but representing the Council, right? The intergovernmental element of the EU political system. And at the same time, the largest four members of the European Union, or at least this is how they counted when they put together the G20, that's Germany, France, the United Kingdom, Italy, they are regular members of the G20, and then Spain and the Netherlands, they are now regular members, or they are regularly invited, but they do not count them among the 20 when they count the 20 to the G20. By the way, if you sit sometime and count the G20, you can count in 5 different ways at least. And from my counting, it never turns out to be 20, so I don't know what happens there. But they are not counted, the Netherlands and Spain, but they're always there. And they speak for their countries as national representatives, right? And so in the perhaps the single most important institutional element to world politics, global governance, if you like, of the 21st century, Europe is very much represented in this strange tripartite way. And to conclude this, first, I might get back to this later, I do not think that is quickly transient. I don't think, neither are we stuck in a national past exclusively, nor are we very much on the rush, on the way to something else that is less unfamiliar, right? That seems to be a fairly stable configuration, a fairly stable way of relating to the world outside. That's the one thing. It is strange to many of the others. I can assure you of that. No? So what I hear from representatives, not necessarily at the G20, but in rounds like that, also the G20, is often that if the three voices by and large agree, there might be just one representative from China, one from Brazil, one from Russia. They might say something like, well, if you guys agree, why then are there so many of you here, right? And if they disagree, then what they hear is, well, you need to make up your minds before you turn up here. It just takes too much time to listen to all of you, and some are not particularly interested in these intricacies of the EU, and some are not particularly patient about it. But in sum, the overall, or my take, my view on what has happened is that theoretically unexpected, politically unexpected, and unintended, we have a particular way of dealing with the world. I think tripartite is the right way to describe it. There are different ways to extend it, but this is part of my recent work, and I hope to work further on this. I hope you will see something on these issues in the not too distant future. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you very much, Professor Krotz. Well, when you mentioned tripartite, I immediately had an analogy. Wow, it's an EU version of Walz's levels of analysis. Well, different levels that you talked about have different agents. And Professor Shepard, how do these agencies play, what is their game from bottom up, and how do they react to, let's say, top-down pressures from the international community when European foreign policy is being built?
Thank you very much. I'd also like to thank you for the invitation and also for doing the marketing job on my university for me in the introduction. That's always the opening line at any university visiting day, so that was nicely done. What I would like to focus on today, and originally I was going to be on the first panel, so it's more linked with challenges than perhaps the title of this panel, but I think they're clearly interlinked. But what I want to focus on, following on from Ulrich, is the kind of the second part of that tripartite, which is particularly the intergovernmental foreign security and defense policy. And I want to look at it in terms of how it's changed, and Igor's kind of idea of the international and the national and the internal kind of pressures work perfectly for some of the things I want to say, because I think I want to look at the problems the EU has internally. I mean, it's come a long way from where it was. So you've got to caveat my criticisms of it from the fact that it's already got a lot more than it had 5, 10, 15 years ago. But the international level, the international pressures, the way I'm coming at it from, and we can talk about the US and other actors later, is what kind of challenges is it facing and how can it tackle those challenges? And I think this is set in the context of the EU being talked about both academically, in the media, and especially, I think, within the EU as being a very distinctive actor, as being some kind of unique actor, described in this kind of way in terms of there's all these different levels going on. But also, I think, because it has a more normative view of itself as well, in that I think the kind of actor it wants to push is something that people have labeled civilian or normative or ethical or smart, or a special kind of power, a different kind of power. And one that pursues what Arnold Wolfers a long time ago called milieu goals, as opposed to possession goals. So things that are supposed to be good for the international system community more generally, rather than the kind of national interest-driven foreign policies of the other big players. And I think the kind of the kind of security challenges it's now facing impact on how well it can pursue that objective of being a distinctive actor. Whether the institutional blockages get in the way of it becoming one, or whether the way it does security actually may undermine that in its very own workings. So I think the push it's making now, not just for this idea of being distinctive at a kind of academic normative level, but also the label it's given itself as a comprehensive actor, and particularly pushing the idea that the EU is the civil military actor that NATO isn't, or any other organization isn't, as being the unique thing it can do. Those are being tested by the kind of challenges it faces. And it's appropriate, I think, that this morning's introductory speech was by the Secretary of State for the Interior from Slovenia, because the security challenge the EU faces in its common foreign security policy and even its common security and defense policy were 10 or 15 years ago labeled as internal security issues. And for me, that's the interesting thing, and that's kind of some of the themes I want to explore, is those connections and what the implications are for, I guess, very broadly speaking, governance, how it's structured and what capabilities it has and how it can use it. And if you look through the multiple security strategies the EU comes out with, there are two overarching ones, obviously. The 2003 European Security Strategy, which Stephen Blockman spoke about this morning, is outdated, which is entirely correct commentary, and the more recent internal security strategy. Both of them make explicit claims about a blurring of this divide between the internal and the external security, and the implications of that for what kind of capabilities the EU has and how it can engage with security problems. And you also have, policy makers, including Catherine Ashton, making these claims explicitly. I mean, she said a couple of years ago that it's quite clear to her that internal and external security challenges are interlinked, and that she put the example of immigration and terrorism and said neither is purely an internal or external issue. And for me, that comes to play. That becomes important for what kind of role the EU plays in foreign policy, because foreign policy and security policy is changing for the EU, and that's the international pressure that it's facing, I think. For me, the blurring of this internal-external is not just a geographical one, which is the obvious starting point. There is a geographical element, quite clearly, and this comes back to the idea that, again, I think something that Stephen mentioned earlier today, is that no one country in the EU can deal with most of the threats that are now listed in their national security strategies, let alone in the EU or even NATO security strategies. But there's also an internal-external blurring in terms of the kind of functional or bureaucratic mechanisms and tools. So if you think very traditionally about what the military used to do, and how it was allowed to operate as an external security provider, and what the law enforcement agencies did, very focused on the internal, very different concepts of the use of force, very different areas of governance. Those are coming together increasingly, particularly in the EU's security defense policies. The kind of missions that the CSDP is doing today are actually quite different to when it was set up, and that wasn't that long ago, 15 years or so. And the operations have changed quite significantly. The caveat, quite obviously, and academics are always going to have a caveat, is that this divide has never been completely clear-cut, this internal-external. It was never that simple. But I think that the way the European Union and its member states are talking, they've made this a much higher profile issue than it used to be. And second, the caveat is that this connection, the blurring between internal and external, is not the same across all security challenges or security threats. So what I want to briefly do is kind of outline a few statements from the overarching security strategies to make the case that this is the way the EU is thinking about it. Then touch upon some of the security threats that the EU has identified. And I think that the need for a revised European security strategy and a comprehensive one, we'll come to the issue of what is comprehensive later on, is absolutely key. Because at the moment, this idea that there are external and internal strategies, I can understand why politically it's there, and I'll touch on those in a minute. But in terms of what security is and how you go about pursuing it, you have to think about it in a much more holistic manner. So I'll look at some of I won't go through them all, obviously. I'll look at some of these challenges where I think there are connections being made quite explicitly, and where I think there might be some advantages to working like this. And then I'll turn very briefly to kind of the institutions, the capabilities, and raise some of the problems that exist now, and then what the problems might be if the solution is to bring these two realms together more closely, because there are clearly issues of accountability and oversight, and I think this is where perhaps European Parliament, which is the last session today, might be quite interesting, in that they have at the moment a strong oversight role in some of these security areas, but not at the moment in the kind of the foreign policy area. So I think that'd be quite interesting. So turning to what these strategies say in terms of making these links, I think they're very different in their origins. The 2003 one was basically a strategy which tried to make Europe look like they were all friends again, that the problems over Iraq were, a one-off, that they did have a common view as to what the main security problems in the world were, and they could talk to each other about it, and they could think about how they wanted to tackle them. It was put together very quickly by a very, very, very small group of people, and its rationale was substantially different to the internal one. The internal security strategy was a more thought-through process. It was a much longer process. More actors were involved in it, from the Commission, the Council, from the member states, and others. So I'm not, they're difficult to compare in some respects. But the interesting thing for me are two strikingly similar characteristics. First is this claim in both of them of this blurring of the internal and external. And so the 2003 strategy talks about the increasingly open borders in which internal and external aspects of security are indissolubly linked. So there's the geographical blurring. A page later, none of the new threats is purely military, nor can be tackled by purely military means. And for me, that's the kind of functional or bureaucratic blurring. The military, and this was mentioned in an earlier panel, the military is not the sole tool in security and defense policy anymore. And in fact, for many European countries, it's becoming less and less of a useful tool, and there's some interesting discussions about what exactly the role it can play. The internal strategy talks very much about an internal security not being able to exist without external dimension, because the internal security relying heavily on having external security. And you see this with the use of law enforcement agencies in external security and defense missions. And you've had this right from the very beginning of CSDP with the deployment of both police and military in Bosnia and later on in other parts of the Western Balkans. And you now see it in parts of the other neighborhood, which was being talked about earlier, North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa as well. So that's the claim they're making. If you run through the various threats, I think the internal-external divide differs as to how well it's being preserved or not, to what extent it's being blurring. I think there are quite clearly issues which you could say there isn't much linkages here. In a previous discussion I had with someone, they were saying, well, nuclear proliferation, no, you can't really stick it on this spectrum of a blurring security threat. It's largely taking place elsewhere. It's largely being dealt with through traditional diplomatic means. So that might not fit as easily, according to some. The obvious ones where I think there are clear linkages, and it has been for quite a while, is terrorism. The way EU's tackled terrorism has been led by, and this is why it was interesting this morning's talk, by interior ministers. But very quickly and very expansively, it's developed a massive external dimension. It's developed a massive foreign policy dimension. And the military, for better or worse, have been used in pursuing counter-terrorist operations. And that includes not necessarily EU military, but European member states' militaries. I think there's been a lot of literature, quite obviously, about the internal impact of regional conflict and state failure, not least in Europe's own, within its own geography, but also within its neighborhood. So again, the geographical divide is blurred very quickly, and the kind of tools you use, this kind of bureaucratic or functional connection, are very different. So when they set up CSDP, it was very clear that they met in Saint-Malo. They looked around as to what was going on. Britain, for a very, very short moment in time, looked like it was pro-European, and pushed forward an idea in a very sensitive area for both the UK and many other member states. They wanted to do something in security and defense policy. They wanted to do this partly, going back to the opening talk about the US, partly to placate the US, make sure that they stayed on board by saying, look, we are pulling our weight. At least that was Blair's view. The French view was somewhat different. But they basically looked around and they saw what was being planned, contingency planning for what was going to happen in Kosovo and what happened in Bosnia. They said, what we need for the EU is a peacekeeping force or crisis management force, 50, 60,000 strong, to do that kind of thing. What they're doing today is fundamentally different to that. They're not going to deploy, and they never have deployed, a kind of 50,000 strong peacekeeping force. It's much smaller, it's much more focused geographically and thematically. Building on what the Interior Minister was talking about, I think organized crime is one of the key areas where this divide is very, very important and is basically dissolving our understanding of these nice blocks for understanding security policy. Whether it's human trafficking, drug trafficking, small arms, you could even argue components of WMD as well. It's quite clear that geographically and functionally there is no internal and external. There is one security problem here, or multiple ones under that one label. And you have, for example, as I just said, you've got CSDP doing missions in the Sahel, which explicitly talk about counterterrorism and organized crime. An element of what the EU is doing in Bosnia was organized crime, or at least in what it's supposed to be doing is tackling organized crime. It can even go as far as taking a real military mission, EU NAVFOR, off the coast of Somalia, tackling piracy. You know, in effect, even the way they describe it is they fight piracy and armed robbery. You know, that's an extreme version of organized crime. They're basically they're not doing it for some national reason. They're doing it to make money. You know, that's effectively what these people are doing it for. So even a pure military operation like that has a very different rationale behind it. The final thing I think in terms of the kind of threats was also mentioned this morning is cybersecurity. And here I think is the beginnings of a good news story in terms of the way I've approached this kind of topic, in that the way the EU has started to address cybersecurity has moved outside these little boxes of internal and external. They have moved outside these kind of institutional and capability kind of stovepipe pigeonholes. They've started to think much more integrated in how it needs to be tackled. So in this, they tried to update the European security strategy in 2008, but instead they just gave an implementation report, which was nothing like a rewrite. But in there, it states quite frighteningly and categorically that internet crime has been given a new dimension, with attacks on private and government IT systems becoming, quote, a potential new economic, political, and military weapon, which would require a comprehensive approach. And when they get around to developing the cybersecurity strategy, the interesting thing for me is, again, they've looked at it as a comprehensive and holistic kind of problem. They quite explicitly talk about the global reach of the internet, meaning that borders are effectively irrelevant, and that they need synergies between civilian and military approaches to protect the cyber infrastructure and the critical infrastructure of the EU. And you look at their three pillars of network and information security, law enforcement, and defense. So talking about defense in the area of cyber. So those are some of the examples of where I think that this trend is apparent. What are the problems for those are the international pressures in terms of the challenges. But what are the problems for the EU internally? And I think here is that the EU is set up like its member states in some respects, in that they have nice, clear compartments for who does what. They have nice, clear compartments that deal with justice and home affairs, and they deal with CFSP. It's based quite clearly on the member state kind of model as well, which has the same kind of structures. Lisbon tried to reform that. Lisbon talks about getting rid of the pillar structures, but it hasn't really. They're still there in the background quite clearly in terms of the way decisions are made and the way that foreign policy in particular is kept separate, and unanimity is still the way to do it. The current High Representative and Vice President of the Commission has, for reasons that Stephen spoke about this morning, been very focused on the High Representative role in building up the External Action Service. So the synergy between that and the Commission hasn't really worked particularly well. It may, if you're being optimistic, in the next iteration. So there is this real stovepiping, and it's quite clear because they've followed the member states model. The member states wanted it set up like that with the pillars that haven't quite gone away because of the sovereignty issue. The other problem they have is that there's different understandings about what they mean by the comprehensive approach. There's different understandings, not just between 28 different voices, but there's also, you can add another 5 or 10 different voices about inter-institutional voices and arguments between the various institutions. Because it's turf wars, not just between the member states as to who controls what or who does what, but between the various institutions. So you've got and it's not, again, it's not just between the EAS and the Commission, but it can happen within the EAS, and it happens within the Commission. So you get a big problem in terms of different understandings of what the comprehensive approach is, and the comprehensive approach is still largely based, quite naturally, I think, at this point, on the foreign policy, but it hasn't brought in a lot of these internal security issues. And I think that this also has a whole range of implications in terms of the capabilities that the EU has. And as I've mentioned, it has to rethink how it integrates the capabilities, because using the police and other law enforcement agencies overseas is a fundamental change in what they do. Using the military in a very different way overseas, but even potentially internally, in terms of civil protection, solidarity clause, responding to terrorism, is a very different basis for what they do. And they're not comfortable with either, and they're not set up for either, and there needs to be a fundamental change in how they understand their particular roles. So I think for the capability side, there are lots of big tensions as well. So I think overall, the challenges from the outside world, the kind of security threats that the EU is facing, are much more complex and intertwined than they used to be. And that has implications for how it goes about its business, for how it makes decisions, for which department talks to another department. Things like security strategy for cyber, and even the one that's being evolved now for the maritime strategy, show that the EU can start to cooperate. So you get different parts of the External Action Service and the Commission talking to each other and coming to a conclusion that is unanimous across there and that is quite comprehensive. So there is hope. But I think the important thing to consider is that the kind of challenges it faces give it the opportunity to be this distinctive actor it wants to be. But there are still a number of kind of institutional, kind of normative problems that might prevent it from doing so at the moment. Because if you start thinking about using the military to tackle certain other security issues, you get into a whole realm of the securitization literature and securitization issues and the dangers of everything becoming a security issue. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Well, we already have received some questions via Twitter and for the panelists, which is great. But please do be a bit patient. There will be a Q&A session in the end. And I know, although Professor Boštjan Udrović, your name is not Igor, but you are very eager, I know, and you will get the microphone. So don't worry in the end. Professor Shepard, you were very like most of the speakers today, you were very critical about the European security strategy from 2003. And this is something that also, when I went through the notes of Professor Hyde-Price, he would be. And there was a quote in his notes saying that this strategy, it's not a strategy, it's an aspiration, it's only a dream. And what it shows you is that basically, although we have nations and countries that have strategic culture, strategic history, geopolitical culture, geopolitical history, the EU has not developed this. The EU has not developed a geopolitical culture, geopolitical strategic culture. For instance, just look at the US, you always get the discussion, what is the geopolitical orientation, what is a geopolitical strategy of the United States. There seems to be, EU seems to be lacking this. And of course, during this conference, we reached many reasons why this is so, because states are afraid of and want to keep their sovereignty, foreign policy, diplomacy, military, and also constitution is a big part of their sovereignty. They don't want to let that go. But there's another aspect as well, and this is trust. Do nations in Europe trust each other, Professor Burgles? And if they don't, is EU the biggest prisoner's dilemma that we have? And basically, what's your view on this internal issue that EU foreign policy is facing?
Thank you for a very good question. Thank you also for inviting me here. But yeah, I will try to answer around. And I would start actually with what you actually started with as an anecdote. Europe speaking with one voice, and you said press 1, then you get Germany. Press 25, you get what? Slovenia? Nothing? Do we have foreign policy or something like that? And I would, in this respect, I would say also, let's say, just for the sake of discussion, the comparison you both, or you try to compare European foreign policy or foreign policy of the European Union with theoretical examples, Balts, etc. You can compare these things also with Slovenian foreign policy. We had 3 voices, at least, but then the question is, what was the substance of such policies? Irrespective of that, something always happened in practice, in everyday life. So you had even in terms of, let's say, a kind of cooperation diplomatically. within international organizations. You had quite huge cooperation in terms of some not so important issues, always either United Nations or somewhere else. So you get quite some such. Okay, I would say that the presence of European or foreign policy of the European Union is independent on what kind of abstraction you would like to take it. This will be one of the issues. The other issue, which is perhaps also important, and yeah, what kind of internal structure is it within the European Union? For me, the understanding of foreign policy is more or less a service for the society. What kind of a society do we have within the European Union? And this kind of society is more or less based on the competition. And if it is based on the competition, then it's very hard, to have, let's say, a common understanding towards various regions in the world. So different, let's say, geopolitical imaginaries are there. You have, let's say, different power games or different positions of particular member state within the European Union somehow prevents them to really influence the substance of foreign policy. Then the question if they really know what to pursue through the European Union, what kind of goals they would like to make through that. And I wouldn't say that there is really huge trust within the, let's say, between member states even. Despite, nowadays we will speak about trust also in diplomacy and such things that, there is different institution. This is not no more noble eyes around the world, but much more connected with, let's say, fair coordination, cooperation. Where I see the specificity of the European Union foreign policy is that actually this foreign policy sometimes breach the limits which are not normal within the national foreign policies. Okay, one example. Within the national foreign policies, there is a lot of things about values, ethics, pursuing human rights through foreign policy or something like that. But you cannot really, let's say, object to what the government is doing abroad in terms of human rights. But the institutions of the European Union are sometimes, not always, but are sometimes limited by some human rights concerns, like Kadi case or something like that. This is not something unintentionally happened, but it is perhaps good for the, let's say, a kind of coherency of foreign policy. Okay. Basically, what I would also like to add is that the instrument of the foreign policy, meaning European External Action Service, and its complementarity with the national approach, I'm intentionally speaking about complementarity, is an aspect where actually you cannot trust that everything which will happen at the union level will be good for particular member states. You cannot, sometimes, okay, in terms of rationality, it will be very good that probably you will not need embassies in every place in the world where you have some interest. But still, there are some interests which you cannot actually pursue through this European External Action Service, in particular, like things like economic diplomacy or something like that. You know, how to do that in the name of entire union, where you have center and when you have periphery, when you have very different interests within the union itself. When you have some states which are much more dependent and others which are, let's say, relatively independent. I wouldn't say that any state nowadays is totally independent, but nevertheless, those are things which do not allow total trust, but I would say more, let's say, pragmatic cooperation, coalition building, something like that, and the state like Slovenia can afford itself to be sometimes, you know, something like honest broker or something like that. You know, this was, you know, always the idea what small states should do with such supranational or also, I would say, intergovernmental organizations, but. Nevertheless, their voice is not heard enough. And then is another question. Speaking about foreign policy as, let's say, a service to the society itself. Within the foreign policy of the European Union, there is a question to whom actually this foreign, for whom is this made? Either only for member states, for the citizens, European Union citizens, and this is not the same thing, and those European Union citizens, the voice of those European Union citizens is in foreign policy heard very rarely, and even when it's emerged, it is not taken into account, like Iraq. So you know you have a lot of problems actually with what I would say legitimizing internally the foreign policy of the European Union, and without really some efforts in this direction, we cannot speak really about the trust within those pursuing foreign policy. Or those deciding about foreign policy, and yeah, I'm not positive on the trust issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Burgles. Well, before we move from Stila to Charybda, is there anyone on the panel who would like to reply to any of you? Last comments on the internal challenges? No? Going once? Going twice?
Sad. We'll turn this into something else.
Yeah, that's right.
I'd be happy to discuss anything you actually.
Okay, then let's move on because we only have half an hour left. So let's move on to Charybda. Okay. Right. Well, the first challenge, well, let me start with a quote again. In 1985, the Belgian Prime Minister once said, Mark Eskens once said, the EU is economic giant, political mouse, and military worm. You can figure out where I'm going with this. Of course, the EU-US relations and the NATO-EU security and defense relations. I was in DC in 2011, at Georgetown University, and we attended also a panel on one of the think tanks in DC, and there was a high-ranking person from the Pentagon. And I posed very provocative question. There was a debate about how to reduce military budget in the US. And I rose up, I was one of the few people from Europe, and I said, look, you guys have big budgetary issues. Why don't you move all your military out of Europe and you will spare some money? Why don't you think of that? And the answer was no, we will not do that. And it was straight straightforward answer. No, we will not do it. And then he stopped talking. So on one side, the US always says, EU, you have to take your share of the burden. But on the other side, they do not let us take the burden. So, dear panelists, what is your comment on the EU-USA relations, on the NATO, European foreign policy, European security policy relations? Professor Shepard, please.
I think on your last point, the US is now very happy for the EU to take a burden. I think you're right. In a few years ago, they were very wary. So when CSDP was launched, you had, Madeleine Albright and her 3Ds about, discrimination, decoupling, all those kind of things. And they were doing exactly what you said. We want you to do more, but we want to be in control of what you do. And that's it. But I think right now, they just want us to do more. Full stop. They don't really mind, because, and this coincides, I think, not just with, it's been coming a lot longer, but it coincides with the so-called Asian pivot, which is a very slow pivot by Obama. But it coincides with that as well. I think it's very much now, you are, as Solana said, pretty much safe, secure, and prosperous. Relative to the rest of the world, safe, secure, and prosperous. So get on with it, sort out problems in your own backyard. And I think Newland's quote, which came out several times this morning, sums up their annoyance with not being able to deal with stuff in the neighborhood, which is the focus of what Stephen was talking about this morning. I think the real letdown and the measure that Ashton set herself and the EU set itself has been a problem in not being able to deal with the neighborhood. I'm not saying that the problems aren't massively difficult to deal with, but I think for the US it is a frustration. I think in terms of political giants and military worm, I think the EU doesn't have to be a military giant to do the kind of foreign policy it wants to do. I don't think the military is the tool it would like to use first and foremost, and it's unlikely to be the tool that it can use. But it is one that it needs to have, but it needs to be different to what they've got now, and it can be, if it's put together, it can be smaller than what it is now. But that's on the basis that there's not 27, 28 different land forces, air forces, navies, and all the rest of it. So, and the second thing, apart from the capabilities, is the idea of approaches, and that's why I think the military is a smaller influence on EU foreign policy than it is in US foreign policy, because there's still much more of a role for the military to get things done. And it goes back to, which is a very provocative article, which I like to use with the students. It goes back to the Kagan article. Are they just saying we're normative because we don't have military power? Is effectively what he said. He said you can't do this, so you come up with a label for how you do soft power or diplomacy in a different way. But right now, I think the US would be more than happy for the EU to do it, and to do it in the way that they saw fit. And the frustration is that they're not.
Okay. Professor Groth, please.
Did you want to take it?
No, I would after.
That is often very smart to go last. That's fine. Okay. So on the issue, transatlantic relations, US, Europe, and I mean now EU plus nation states, and EU in the double sense I introduced it before. So allow me to step back. So I've become convinced that if in the future historians or political scientists will look back at the last decade, this decade, and the next decade, maybe the next 2 decades, as this is now a large chunk of time, I'm aware of that, right? But I have become convinced that what we are witnessing in a larger sense is Europe's emancipation from the United States. If you want to use the vocabulary, my teacher was Peter Katzenstein. He wrote a book on the American Imperium. It seems to me that Europe is experiencing its own decolonization out of the American Imperium. in spite of, and this comes in both letters now, in spite of everything that we've said in the first round, and that I'm sure has come out in other panels, in spite of the many shortcomings, the fragilities of European foreign security defense policy, as well as other policy areas, in spite of the contingency, in my view, something is changing at the more deeper level. And with that, I do not necessarily mean that Europe, in its three ways, as I see it now, right, necessarily will always be at odds with the United States, that there necessarily will be always open fights or tensions or disagreement. There will be all of this, and there has been over the past 15 years, but there also will be a lot of agreement, even in new issues, and just by habit, by values, by materially constituted interest, also the United States and Europe in its various phases will often find themselves on the same side of the table and agreeing. So I just want to make sure that when I'm saying emancipation or own decolonization, this is not necessarily conflict, but it is something different. It's starting to do one's things in a way that is no longer under the same kind of tutelage that at least during the Cold War and in my view the first post-Cold War decade or decade and a half, things have taken place under the tutelage of the United States. This is changing, it's a different thing. I could list examples. I want to cut short. I mean, you brought up NATO in your question. However you might criticize or dismiss or ridicule the rise of European foreign security defense policy, even if you consider it very small, there is something to it which is at its core, and it is not just a European pillar within NATO or burden sharing, as Alistair has used the word. Can be both. Burden sharing can be a European pillar. A stronger European pillar within NATO's distinct Cold War vocabulary and post-Cold War vocabulary, right? With that I mean of the now past. I consider we are now in the post-Cold War era. It's a different thing. This is not just a European pillar. In fact, in my view, it is exactly not a European pillar within NATO. It's something European. And in the spirit of what I said, this does not necessarily mean conflict all the time. This is not even necessarily anti-NATO. It's just not core NATO. And it does have implications for NATO. I think it adds to NATO's identity crisis in certain ways. Whatever we want to think NATO today is, I think it is two things not. It's hard to say what it is. I can tell you what I think it is, but it doesn't matter. Two things it is not. It is not the integrated Cold War war-making machine it used to be, in order to keep, the lines and the jokes. The Germans down, we will see about that, but it did keep the Soviets out, and it did keep the Americans in, and it was fairly integrated for an alliance. It was more than an alliance, and in a few of many, including myself. That no longer it is. And there's another thing NATO is not, which many have thought it would be in the years after the fall of the wall, and that was that NATO would turn out some kind of military arm of a more or less united West. And that it is not either. It will not disappear very quickly, as many has thought it. It will not necessarily weaken. It is weaker now, and it is less central than it has been during the Cold War. There's no question about it, in my view. But it is not the main frame in which Europeans are doing their ways. Whether or not they fuse and mix inside and outside, internal, outer, they do their things in own ways. It is not within NATO. This is just one example of many, many others I could give why I think there is something going on, a deeper shift. And that will mean Europe is searching for itself with a lot of nonsense talk and a lot of rhetoric. This over-moralistic language, vocabulary that you often get. In my view, that too is part of Europe searching for itself. I think it will go away, not quickly. Because I think in all the moralistic, it's mostly Europeans talking to themselves. It's not Europeans talking to the world, right? That is part of this, but on a different level, on a deeper level, we are not as integrated and not part of the leadership and the tutelage of the United States as Western Europe was, let alone as Eastern Europe was the Soviet Union. That's kind of entirely. If you want a second example, we'll keep this very short. No? This is part of this work of the tripartite I mentioned earlier. This is a friend and colleague of mine who happens to know very much about Russia and about energy and gas politics. And this is, of course, a key policy area of Europe relating to Russia has economic dimensions of enormous. I mean, the people who work on gas in the next decades, they don't even count in millions, right? The lowest unit for them seems to be a billion, is a milliard. I'm using American English. Huh? And there you also see this very clearly, the single states, the French, German, Italian firms, along with BASF, E.ON, and Gazprom, they work out Nord Stream, this gas pipeline, right? That is at the national level, the connection. At the Commission pushed something completely in the other direction. That was Nabucco, which is something that Russia considered fundamentally anti-Russian, right? And the Council is again different from the Commission and the single nation state. What the Council pushed and still pushing is diversification, right? Not necessarily the Nabucco type of the Commission, which now seems to be in trouble, nor is it necessarily just backing up what the nation states do with Nord Stream, including some of the very big European energy companies. So in that sense, you see how this comes out, but this comes out in very different faces and voices, but there is one thing, these three voices, as my colleague formulated, I think, in a wonderful way. There is one thing that these three European voices have in common, and that is they all speak entirely without any American accent. And this is just another one, I don't even think that's a small example, but just think for a moment, back to Cold War times. You will not seriously be able to imagine that the European Commission, let alone Germany, let alone France perhaps partially, let alone Germany, not Italy, would independently, no matter now whether you're at the supranational level or the national, would independently lead negotiations, discussions with the Soviet Union / Russia, whatever you prefer, without the Americans being briefed and briefing any time of any of these people would meet. I'm aware that this is not necessarily a headline news, right? And this is not, it's complex and it's in many ways obscure, but this is not small politics. This is security, energy security, which is very high on the agenda for many Europeans, national and EU level. And it is, of course, in the double, triple, we don't even know how many digit billion range. And in all of these phases, I will not continue now introducing other examples to underline the point, but in many different ways, this may be nastier in ways, NSA, 2003, Iraq, and all of this, or it may not be. And it includes a lot of agreement, a lot of cooperation. Don't misunderstand me. But the thing as a whole, if you add everything together, I think there's a shift, or I have become convinced there's a shift away. And this is not the breakup of the transatlantic relationship, but it is something like European emancipation, and this takes place not within NATO, and it does not take place within a politically united West.
Thank you very much, Professor Krotz. You already touched upon the EU-Russia relations that we will get to in just a moment. Professor Burgles, EU-US.
Yes, just some small remarks, I would say, in this respect. As I see the relationship like, let's say, an equal partnership, where is very clearly who is speaking for the West, or mostly it is very clearly who is speaking for the West on one side, and if there is a kind of emancipation, it is more or less symbolical. Even if someone can argue that this is not the same civilization. When we speak, for instance, about human rights, the understanding of human rights, this is totally different civilization. This is, you know, but I would not explain all those things, not to burden you and to go further on. But nevertheless, there are, you know, a kind of cooperation. It is possible, but emancipation is more or less symbolical. And part of this symbolical emancipation, which is also important for us, or important in terms of, you know, staying for international community in terms of what are values there, perhaps European Union is closer to such an aspect. But, okay, thank you.
Okay, let's move on then to the already mentioned EU-Russia relations. It was on the table many times already at this conference, but you know, when Slovenia wants to solve, let's say, our minority problems in Italy, we should go to Rome and deal with it in Rome, not in Trieste. So my question to the panel is, should the EU, when solving Ukrainian crisis, go to Moscow, not to Kiev? So what is, in your perspective, EU-Russia relations? Anyone?
They should go to both places, and that's what they're doing. It's clear that the EU and the nation states have relations with Russia, and it's that there are relations and that there will be. About that we can be sure.
No?
Probably, yeah. I would agree with that. We should go to the both places at the same time. On the other side, perhaps European Union should be much more engaging Russia and not so much containing it, because this is not really the interest of the European Union, but perhaps of the United States.
Thank you. I think they have to go to both places. I think the EU, well, it comes back to this tripartite system and the multiple voices. But I think the EU is quite bad at expressing interests, and Russia's very good at expressing interests. And I think that's where the clash comes. The Russians you know, they have an extremely centralized way of thinking about foreign policy. One person, that maybe 1.5 people will say this is what we want, and that's what they pursue, and they decide on how they're going to pursue it. The EU can't do that, and I think that's where the problems come in the relationship, because of the multiple different interests in the EU. And even if there was I think a common interest in the EU, and I think there broadly is one within Ukraine, the EU itself as an institution doesn't have the confidence to express it as an interest that Russia would kind of understand, you know, because it's still, like the US, it talks in hard interests. And the EU almost deliberately doesn't do so, apart from in some areas outside of the kind of foreign policy sphere.
This is. I just would like to add one sentence to the statement. I think this is entirely correct. What Ernest had just been saying. Just a few weeks ago at the European University, there was a workshop on regional governance, or regional views of global governance. And so the idea was, does this mean all different things for different parts of the world, right? And there was a very knowledgeable woman professor from Russia, and her opening statement was that the vocabulary does not exist in Russia. Yeah. So whereas it seems to be the dominant vocabulary within Europe, it makes us feel better, obviously. Yeah. But I'm not saying that people using or actors using different vocabulary could not talk to each other, and maybe they can even understand each other, but it is clear that in many ways many Europeans and Russians, when it comes to diplomacy on this kind of thinking, seems to move in different orbits, and I think it's very nicely expressed with, I agree with Alice's statement there.
Okay, slowly but surely we're coming to the end of the panel. So keep in mind that we still have a Q&A session real quick. I know Boštjan Udovic will pose a question, but we will take 2 of them or 3 of them if we have time. Two, okay. So I see two hands, okay, already. But before I give you the floor and the microphone, one last bilateral relations we have to tackle. This is EU-China. Just recently, ING released a great report on the slowing down of the Chinese economic growth. And sooner or later, not only that this slowdown of the economic growth will also lead to, let's say, some social reforms maybe, or at least social struggles. But my question would go in a different direction. This is soft power, which is something that Professor Shepard rose. Of course, EU had a big amount of soft power, being a model of development. Let's say ASEAN copied it, and also other regional organizations. But China seems that it developed its own soft power, its own model of development, which of course with the slowing down of economic growth could be at risk, but still it is present. So how do you see it, EU-China relations through this perspective?
I don't think I see it through a soft power perspective, because I don't think it comes back to vocabulary again. I think China's idea of what soft power is and what the EU thinks of soft power are vastly different. I think the interesting point on EU-China relations is not necessarily what the EU thinks of China and what the EU thinks China should be doing, but what China thinks of the EU. And I think when China talks about security, it doesn't consider the European Union at all. I'm not a Chinese specialist, but it's not, you know, economically, the EU is something it needs to engage with. In terms of what China's security interests are, the EU, I don't think, is very far. It's nowhere near the center of their radar. So I think that's the way to look at it, is why would China want to talk to the EU? The EU is not going to get involved, particularly in any of the issues in the South, in the Southeast Asia, in East Asia, in the China Sea. Those are very different actors that China's going to want to engage with or be concerned about.
Yeah. Did you?
No, this time I will
pass. Well, these are a lot of very big questions within a few seconds. No? So, in order to directly connect to what Alistair says, I think that's right, and this might make a lot of things easier from a Chinese perspective. Exactly that the EU as a whole, and with some minuscule ambitions that I don't think they take seriously either when it comes to the United Kingdom and France, does not have hard security interests, cannot express them, or if it tries to, China has no reason, I think from mostly Chinese perspective, to take them seriously. That means building up a partnership has absent a number of potentially irritating aspects and issues. Yeah? So I think from China's point of view, a lot of things they worry about when it comes to the United States, to a lesser degree, but also not entirely absent when it comes to Russia. The EU, I don't know, we are very rich, probably somewhat decadent, a little lazy, but we're not going to cause them very much troubles in their neighborhood. And for the relationship, the evolving relationship between China and Europe, EU and other kinds of Europe, I agree with what Alistair said, but it seems to me it will make things easier than if Europe would take a strong stance on the Taiwan issue. I don't think it would be very wise for Europe to do, not only because we probably cannot find a common stance anyway, but even if we could, it will take decades for us to speak in any way that those who really care would take seriously for pure capability reasons.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, in the back, please, first question, Professor Rudovic.
I have a short question about the diplomacy of the European Union. It is linked to the national diplomacies, and I would like just to know in short whether the European Union diplomacy will in the future, next 30, 50, 100 years, replace national diplomacies or not? Just a short question. Thank you.
Professor Burglas, please. Yeah.
Short question, short answer. No. not at all, and even after that. Okay?
This is another. Your question seems to imply that everything else roughly remains the same. The only question is what the Europeans will become like. And I'm not certain that the assumption is warranted. Not to sound too boastful, I do think that I have a sense of what things might look like in 30, 40, maybe 50 years. I had no clue what world politics will look like in 100 years. And the only thing that will be very different or might not be terribly different from now, most certainly will not be only the Europeans.
Again, I think quite a short answer. No, but it might for some states in the EU, actually, I think. But for the EU as a whole, it won't. But I think it may be a way for some states, particularly given all the foreign policy, security policy, defense policy cuts and in terms of money and resources and personnel, it might be a vehicle to which some of the less resourced or even the more medium resourced ones might start to use more, but it's not going to replace national ones, I don't think. The one interesting thing I would say on comparing the EU to national foreign policy making and diplomacy is, and it feeds off what we said in this panel and other panels, is that I think the EU is held to a very different standard to national foreign policies. I think this was touched upon just a little bit earlier, in that we look for coherence, consistency, comprehensiveness, and everything else at the EU level, and as soon as we don't find it, we're like, this is a failed foreign policy. You can't find coherent, consistent, comprehensive foreign policies in any EU member state, because there are dissident voices in each of those blocks, and they are competing interests in those blocks. UK foreign policy is not coherent, consistent, and comprehensive. So it's just something I wanted to say. I think we're measuring it in almost to an artificial level compared to the national level.
Okay, thank you. Last question.
Okay. Zlatko Mikulic from Slovenian Pan-European Movement. We have heard today several times about this big US hard power. But if you switch on TV channel or switch on the computer, and if you go to the center past the McDonald's, you see how huge is American soft power. So my question is, does EU has a soft power what it is? Thank you.
I don't want to go first.
No? Who will be the first one to reply?
No one's looking up.
No?
No, not yet.
Not yet? Okay, Professor Krot.
Well, there's, it's again a very small question, easy to answer in a sentence, in 3 sentences, like most of the other questions. I know you're packing a lot of big issues in very little time, but whatever we criticize about Europe ourselves, or whatever, it does not matter where you stand politically or theoretically. For many in the neighborhood, in the extended neighborhood, in the rest of the world, Europe seems to represent a fairly attractive lifestyle. And this is soft power by its very core. And not to be too nice, Europe has something. I think that matters for many. It's not the United States. So when you talk about European soft power, I often think that the other side of the same coin is a not insignificant degree of anti-Americanism within Europe and the rest of the world. And somehow that is something the Europeans get on their checking account too. Yeah? So it is part of the nature of the soft power that only aspects of it are instrumentally used or instrumental use, because it's so amorphous, yeah, and multifaceted. If Europe can reform that it can live on a high degree of wealth, I think this is something that will be part of Europe's baggage suitcase from which it can draw. It is not attractive, though, if Europe is coterminous with permanent crisis and not even in the singular. So I think the future of Europe, it has a lot of soft power, 2 aspects I mentioned, but the future of European soft power, and now I'm very agentic, I think in the first place will depend on what the Europeans make out of Europe. If we are organizing a future of permanent muddling through, unable to reform or reform in ways that are insufficient, and I'm not naming countries, but you plug in countries that are easy to plug in, this is not what will give us respect or whatever comes under this terms of time in the future. But I have not given up, including those countries that have a particularly hard time to reform. I live in one of them.
I think in terms of soft power, there's been a part of Joe Nye's kind of idea of soft power is the power of attraction, and I think the power of attraction has waned in recent years, partly for for very particular hard interests in terms of economic power because of the economic problems within Europe as a model. I think that model has lost some of its attraction. Whether it will rejuvenate itself will be very important in terms of its ability as to be a soft power through the power of attraction. The other thing I would say on the flip side is that the various labels I talked about at the very beginning of my talk about normative power and civilian power and those kind of things, and soft power is one of the labels it's given to, is that on that spectrum for Joe Nye, hard power is not just the military. And the key element of hard power is coercion. And the EU can, when it wants to, in particular areas, act very much in terms of hard power, because it has that coercive ability through its economic clout as a global economic superpower. And it does so in terms of all the various policy areas that have been criticized before. Common agricultural policy has been criticized as being a very coercive, kind of approach to particular parts of the world. It's not seen as a benign kind of actor in that respect. But I think its fundamental ethos is much more around this idea of soft power and the power of attraction. And I think there it has good foundations. They've been chipped away a little bit, but that's where rebuilding those is where its power of attraction will come back, I think.
It's hardly something to add to what was said already. Probably where I see, or I always associated the soft power of Europe with this idea of normative power, such things. But the way of living is perhaps much more important. So the development of the European Union, also in terms of internal solidarity, will perhaps add something to, let's say, rising the soft power. If the situation is so diverse, or where the model of social welfare is more or less collapsed, then actually there will be no continuation of soft power which was possible. Yeah, this is my idea.
Okay, and this brings us to the end of this very exciting panel. I would like to thank all of you for sticking around, for the questions, and listening to us. Thank you.